Thank you everyone for joining today's elusive webinar, NIST and the Cybersecurity Framework for Financial Services, actively defending against malicious actors. My name is Jason Silberman. I'm on the product marketing team here at Elusive. I'm just gonna make a couple of preliminary announcements and then turn things over to our presenters. Our presenters today are Mike St. Cross and Rick Tomlin. We will talk about them in a second. But a couple of preliminary announcements. One is that today's webinar is being recorded and you will receive a copy of the recording likely tomorrow. So keep an eye out for that. That'll be in your email inbox. The second thing I want to say is that we will reserve time today for questions. You can ask questions in the Q&A tab on your webinar control panel. We'll keep an eye on that and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Mike St. Cross, our federal team leader at Elusive. Mike, over to you.
Hey, Jason, thanks for the introduction and sharing the ground rules for the session today. I'm going to move to the first slide just briefly. Again, speaker today, Mike St. Cross, will be covering the first few sections of the agenda, and then my colleague, Mr. Rick Tomlin, will be showing us some capabilities as well in the session today. Again, thanks for joining us. The topic, is the NIST and the cybersecurity framework, and particularly digging into the active defense principles and controls. So essentially, there are new building blocks to thwart advanced persistent threats and provide protection. And a lot of that synergy, because the cybersecurity framework is aligned with NIST 800-53 to provide the the multi-regulatory assessment and compliance results for global financials. What's interesting and new today is that the NIST 800-53 revision 5 is now officially been released. It's finalized, and the new 853 R5A and B versions are due shortly on the assessment and testing procedures. And the newer controls in NIST 853 that are particularly targeted at advanced persistent threats have really been driven by the thought work that was done in the 800-160 Volume 2, which is the principles of cyber resilience. So we have the concept that we have primary effects, which are the controls we're putting in place to mitigate the risks that have been identified. And essentially, we have an infrastructure today in security with many different areas: identity and access management, logging, audit, those types of capabilities that are giving us our primary effects. But to be resilient for APTs, there's some new principles to factor in, and that's now showing up in the standards and regulations. Even a complementary standard that's being released is the 800-172, and 172 has the supplemental controls that again line up for cyber resilience. This is mainly being prescribed to Department of Defense suppliers, but they are prescribing this for the supply chain. If you want to do business with the government, you will be implementing these types of controls. Along those lines, some of the more interesting things that have surfaced to the top here is looking at implementing deception for early detection as part of our cyber resilience strategy. And this moves organizations into a new model of actively defending their enterprises with a new detection ability versus just looking for indicators of compromise. Now we have a new ability to fulfill a control with really a higher level of effectiveness. The same principle is applying to high value asset identification to provide better security around crown jewels. And then finally, there's the proactive measure of attack surface reduction that is focused on eliminating key threat vectors that today's malicious actors, malicious insiders are exploiting. So within NIST 800-53 the things that stand out in at least the deception category, which of course Elusive Networks is a provider in, is the concept of decoys, creating deceptive information that attackers engage with because it's focused on the things they need to move laterally, the things that they need to upgrade privilege on. And that's the new control SC26. We also have another similar system and communications control class member, which is misdirection and concealment. Very similarly, we want to protect our high value assets with deceptions, with more of the principle of, concealing things and misdirecting the malicious actors to engage there versus with the actual real systems. And finally, tainting the environment is really to, a good example of this would be creating beaconing files that if they're engaging in malicious activity to get into file shares, to start moving information, there are beacons inside these documents that will alert that they're being interacted with. And again, these are tainted deceptive artifacts, and that's in the SI20 control, which is new as well. When we're looking at what's applicable within the cybersecurity framework control areas, in the life cycle, you do have detection, and within detection you have the detection of anomalies and events. And what's interesting here is the cyber resilience principle of deception now gives us a new control that gives us 100% positive and deterministic identification of malicious activity. Again, because these deceptions are particularly designed to lure and entice attackers to engage, thinking they're going to get lateral movement ability or they're going to get privileged access escalation. And these do fit into a common set of NIST 853 control overlays, in the audit, control analysis, contingency planning, identifying critical assets, as well as better process around incident handling, risk assessment, and system monitoring. So we'll get a little bit more into this, and part of the discussion today, we do make available a white paper that goes into much more detail than we're just touching on surface concepts in the discussion today. Again, another area here is the continuous monitoring within the detection control class and process. And really, this principle here of reducing the attack surface, again, is focused on those things that are enabling lateral movement and credential abuse, essentially. Therefore, you have AC2 for access control mapping into the model, but you also have newer aspects in the system and communications area. But this would add in a expected update for CSF, the SC26 and SC30s would be included in there as well. And finally, just with the deception controls, you have just better detection process. And again, having a capability that's not relying on just indicators of compromise, whether it's file hashes or behavioral indicators, you actually have this active engagement, by getting the bad actor to, raise their hand and really expose themselves. Again, this is giving more dynamic capability around the system monitoring and just analysis of the environment with a better detection process. So the summary we put together, again, this is available in the white paper. The advanced persistent threat protection control focus, is mapping into, 4 of the 5 categories: identify, protect, detect, and respond. And this is kind of the periodic table view of the control areas that are satisfied with these new capabilities in the cyber resilience areas. There's also a mapping to the relevant NIST 853 R5 control updates, but you can see as we have briefly discussed, the AU6 for audits, CA7, IR45, RA3, RA5, SC26, SC30, SI20, SI4. They're all in this, key mapping. And again, there's new capability to implement essentially at the end of the day that does provide more effective risk mitigation. So when we look at the threat context, and this is looking at it from an ISO 27005 perspective, the things that are most certain to happen from a cyber incident context is malicious actors will leverage or exploit the top threats. Privilege account compromise, undetected compromise, active command and control, malicious configuration change, as well as authenticator compromise. And what's interesting is, as we look at, these threats are certain to be exercised because of, just look at advanced ransomware today and just the proliferation of those attacks and the increased pace of those attacks, the active attempts by Microsoft and the US government to take down the TrickBot command and control infrastructure. This is a certain thing. It's happening daily, weekly, monthly. And again, the attack path, the crown jewel pathway is to land on the edge, move on the network, get to a critical system, critical data set, and that has the highest confidentiality impact. So we're looking at these threats. They're certain to happen. So they're getting a 10 on a 1 to 10 score. And when they get to the server critical data set, it has the highest impact in terms of the confidentiality compromise. And the top 5 vulnerability vectors that are being exploited here are network flaws, operating system, and web. So the vulnerability game isn't necessarily providing better, control effectiveness, but focusing on the top threats and the threat vectors through these vulnerabilities, and the fact that there are certain to be exploited and have a high impact. This elimination of cyber incident threats really eliminates cyber incident consequence. So when we're looking at, what risk groups really apply to malicious action, this is in the human deliberate logical risk category. There is human operational inadvertent in context as well for just errors in configuration that lead to undetected compromise. But when you're looking at from just a standard scoring baseline, again, these threat and risk groups are certain to occur. They're 10 on the likelihood scale, and many of them are very high on the confidentiality impact scale. So we're looking at a new set of controls that we can implement that mitigate or eliminate or even, to some degree reduce these very high impact risks that are likely to occur in the enterprise. And just to provide a context, because advanced ransomware is so prevalent today, working with one of our active customers, they called in for some help on detecting. They weren't fully utilizing capability. We quickly assisted them to do that, and we immediately got a suspicious interaction on the print server. Essentially, a cached RDP session was leveraged by the malicious actor, which happened to be the Fin7 group, leveraging the TrickBot infrastructure to execute their command and control. What's interesting, this attack was, targeting a work from home employee, and they did interact with the spear phishing email, and that led to them getting a foothold in the environment where they did escalate privilege through an admin account, compromising the print server, and then had moved laterally, proliferating bulk encryption setups with a basically the Ryuk malware hidden in a object that did pass the signature check with their endpoint protection. But it's, essentially the elusive engagement with the deceptive artifact led to this detection and led to the stopping of the carrying out of the bulk encryption exercise as well as identifying the full attack path, that there was a previously undetected compromise, the account authentication and privileged access model that was proliferated, as well as the command and control that was established, the malicious changes that were done to bulk encrypt the environment, and how they were scanning and probing the infrastructure to further move laterally. So in this use case and many others, these are the top threats we're seeing that are mitigated with control implementations that Elusive's capabilities support. So we're looking at providing this 000 world. We want to have zero privileged accounts that can be compromised by attackers. We want to have zero false positives, wasting the time of cyber defenders, and we really want to give time back to the investigators that are really doing full root cause analysis, containment, and eradication. And that, again, that is through the principles of cyber resilience. We want to shrink that attack surface. We want to create an illusion of deceptions that attackers can use to move, and then we want to provide rapid, more efficient process on detecting and containing and eradicating malicious actors. And Elusive does happen to provide an agentless approach to do this, which is unique to the market. Most new technologies require an agent, and there's just too many agents on endpoints these days. So within the demo today, we'll dig into this a bit more, but we're about shrinking the attack surface, as we've talked about today. And we give you an attacker view. When an attacker lands on an endpoint, they begin to map out what credentials are active on the system I'm on, what connections does this system have, because the idea is to move laterally and connect to domain controllers, things that grant privilege. And these are really crown jewels in the environment, as well as things that have high concentrations of users, because that's where I'm going to find a data store. That's where I'm going to find other administrative accounts. So we're looking for what's exploitable, what is in place in cache that should not be there, but policies are being violated. You still have humans in the environment. So essentially, we'll identify what's exploitable, and we'll also remove it with a cleanup policy. Because again, for attackers to accomplish their goals, they need to get privilege escalation, and they need to move laterally to do that. So taking that away while not impacting the business is the advantage that's provided with this really new vulnerability focus and scanning and removal of those vulnerabilities. So this isn't, creating a bunch of new tickets for an administrator to address. The solution is just simply performing according to policy. Again, focused on removing shadow admin, local admin, cache domain credentials, as well as administrative connections between systems. With that view of what's attackable and cleaning it up, the next motion is to plant new deceptive artifacts, new deceptive credentials, new deceptive connections that force malicious actors to engage with them, because there's really nothing else to move with. And this is done on a saturation ratio. So it could be, a 4 out of 5. There's a 80% deceptive artifacts. These are breadcrumbs on the endpoints that aren't viewable by general system users. You have to abuse privilege to see these things using attacker tools like Mimikatz or Windows configuration editor. But when these artifacts are engaged with, an alert is generated. And again, this is okay. We definitely are effective against attackers. We're also effective against red teams. So that's another area where some clients of ours have implemented our solution just to be more effective on the red team side and have zero findings from the red team exercise. But essentially, we're getting an alert, and that alert's generating a data set. And this data set is a very rapidly collected data set in like seconds, focused on volatile and non-volatile data sets. But the big value here is getting this forensics timeline of what has been command line and PowerShell executed on the system. So there's 100% certainty that at the time of alert, you've got visibility into what's happening. So this is a much more efficient process than trying to pull results through agents in minutes, or even 30 minutes to an hour to complete. This is a very rapid visibility. So that's it on the kind of overview content. And I know in this format it is an interactive, get to ask live questions, but please use the chat to submit any questions that you might have at this time that we could perhaps address for you during the demo session. But I'm going to turn over the controls to Mr. Tomlin, and we'll get into the demo.
All right, thanks, Mike. All right, so we're going to start off the demo kind of looking, as Mike said earlier, we take the attacker view of the network. So we're looking at things from the point of view of any given endpoint. Should they compromise that endpoint, take this one here, what can they learn about my network from that particular endpoint? In this case, these are all color-coded. This happens to be a lot of web connections that this particular endpoint is made. If I look over here at, this one here, I've got a lot of RDP connections, a couple of SSH connections. And then, this endpoint here, as an example, is making mostly SSH connections. And there's one SMB connection to a share there. So we're going throughout the entire network and introspecting the different endpoints to understand where, what data lives on those systems that's cached there that an attacker could leverage to be able to attack by network. We're also using the concept of crown jewels to understand, where your high value assets are, your high value targets, to be able to then take all of this information and put it together with a concept that we call pathways. So when I look at one of my top crown jewels here, my domain controller, I can see there's 22 different sources of access to it. And if I look at the concept of exposing the pathways, I've got the system that's not going to cooperate today. But basically it allows me to then explore how that environment gets put together. So as I look at the network and I look at the different endpoints that I've introspected, I'm now able to see how an attacker could leverage that information to move across my network with an eye towards how they'd be able to get to my crown jewels. So we'll try to see if this will cooperate again. So when I look at it here, here's my endpoint, my crown jewel is my domain controller. And as I look, I've got 3 different endpoints that all have a cache connection to that particular domain controller. But when I move this out to 2, 3, 4, 5 hops, I now see a bigger picture across my network of how an attacker, if they happen to land on Win 10, that there's data on Win 10 that allows them to move or discover and then move to computer 10. And then there's a cache connection there over here to computer 7. That has a cache connection down here to the HVAC system on the first floor, which has a cache connection to my domain controller. So the idea is to first and foremost be able to identify the kinds of data that an attacker are going to leverage. The term often used is living off the land, that they can introspect that endpoint and be able to find, a way to move laterally in the environment. The second then is, once we've identified that, is to be able to remediate the environment. So clear all violating paths, and you'll see, some of the ones that are not highlighted here, those may be active, they may not violate some of the rules that we've configured. But using the rules that we've configured, we are instilling cyber hygiene into our network, and we're removing a lot of that data that an attacker could use and leverage to be able to move laterally in my environment. And so what we end up with is a much cleaner network, a much smaller set of connections out there and data that an attacker could exploit to be able to move. Now, once we've cleaned up our network, we're going to basically then take that network as it is, and we're going to basically dirty it up again. We're going to distort the attacker's reality by deploying deceptions into the environment. And when we deploy deceptions into the environment, we basically get to the point where the network starts to look like this. And now we're able to see everything orange in this view is deceptive. So now we've kind of flipped the script a bit. Instead of having, maybe 15 different, hosts on my network, now it looks like there are, 50 plus in the environment. And we give, we're using that data and that extended distorted view of the network to then give the attacker a different view. So now if the attacker happens to land on Win 10 here, what they see is that there are 6 different cache connections, in various places. Now, what they see obviously is not going to be the orange, that gives them the legend on what's deceptive, what's not. Instead, they're going to see this view here. So they're effectively seeing that there's 2 SSH connections in the yellow, the 3 pink are RDP connections. So they'll probably, those would be, data that we've, deceptions that we've cached in their RDP client. And then the green is an SMB connection that we would also, have in there that's deceptive. The idea being that we're now giving them a choice of, as they're looking at the system and as they're introspecting it, they're going to find these different connections. And not knowing that they're deceptive because of the way that we plant them, they are going to at some point attempt to interact with one or more of those deceptions as they look to move laterally in the environment. When they interact with one of those deceptions, it is going to trigger an incident in the environment. So now we'll see, an incident will come up, it'll be flagged, it can be sent off to, to a SIM, it can be alerts to email. And what's going to happen is we're going to get this information here to tell us that a deception was, a deception was tripped. These are the types of deceptions that were tripped here. And now I can see the details. The other thing you're going to see here, as Mike mentioned earlier, is with this, orange circle, forensics are available. So now we're able to grab forensics from that endpoint, and it gives us a viewpoint of exactly what was transpiring on the endpoint that is showing an indicator of compromise, right? So it interacted with our deceptions. The way the deceptions are planted are such that the common user on that system would not be able to see them. So should never interact with any of the deceptions and would not trigger false positives. So the result then is if they are interacting, and you can see there's 2 different sets of interactions here, that there's a high likelihood that this is either a malicious insider attempting to look around, attempting to either elevate their privilege or gather data that they probably don't have access to, or they have been compromised. And we can see data about it. We'll tell you exactly what happened. They targeted the hr.elusive.ng share, which was a deception. And now we can give a lot of other information about the endpoint. It's network connections. And here we can actually see, is there a remote RDP into this endpoint that could be malicious? We're actually going to look at network information here for the different network elements, all the way up to process last runtime, right? And I can see what processes run in the system, and we can ID things like Mimikatz. That's an indicator of compromise, right? All the way down through the command history. And what it allows us to do then is also grab a desktop screenshot. And this is grabbed within a second or 2 of the alert happening. And what it shows then is very quickly, a lot of times we will catch what the attacker or what the person on that endpoint was doing prior to their ability to clean up after themselves. So you can see they're running Mimikatz and harvesting credentials over here in the right-hand side. And then on the left here, they were using psexec to attempt to execute a remote command on one of the, in this case, deceptive servers that they're trying to then utilize the data they've harvested, in this case, the credentials, to be able to access. So with all of that data, we have it here available in a raw format, but we also take it and we correlate it into something we call the forensics timeline. And the forensics timeline is a, by default, reverse chronological order And it starts with the most recent elusive event and then works down through, and you see there's several events here that happened. And the event in and of itself tells us, what happened. There was a share access attempted. They attempted to create a file. They were operating using PSExec. So we can, see that information. But then also going down through, I can see what predated that. So what was going on this system prior to their interaction with our deception? And that's important because that's where you're going to find the indicators of compromise, how somebody got into the system. And you see here they're running PSExec out of Windows Temp. That's typically not a good sign. And they're attempting to access a system called Marshall, with some information that they harvested. And if I look back down a little further down through here, I can see here they're running Mimikatz. And I can now see the details of how they were running Mimikatz. Again, running it out of C Windows Temp, running it as elusive user 3. So that's useful information in terms of how I'm going to attempt to understand whether it's a compromised user, whether it's an insider functioning, et cetera. But these are all indicators of compromise that now I can look at this and take action, whether it's knock the box off of the network or disable the user that we think's been compromised, et cetera. And you get this data very quickly. So you have this data available to you for that, that initial look at how you're working with the environment, and also to inform your incident responders, provide them the data to quickly make a decision and take action without having to to wait a long time. Attackers are typically functioning in the minutes or seconds range. A lot of incident responders are functioning often in the minutes to hours based on the kinds of tools they have to use and how long it takes to get the appropriate data using those tools. So Jason, I think I'll stop there and we can move on.
Sure. Okay. Mike was answering a question that came in through the chat, but I think he's answered that directly. So there were a few other questions. Just to remind people, you can ask questions now, either in the chat or in the Q&A tab on the webinar control panel. We'll monitor both. And we'll keep the questions anonymous. Obviously, we're not going to say your name or anything like that. So ask away. We do have a couple of questions already. Let me just check. Yeah, there was a question about how this type of solution is differentiated from an EDR, or how it complements an EDR solution.
Yeah, so we get that that question quite a bit. So the biggest thing, I mean, first and foremost, this is we complement EDR. We work in a complementary fashion. I think one of the biggest differences is that EDR is probabilistic in terms of its analysis, where we are doing a deterministic analysis. They both have a role in an environment. There are things that that we're not going to catch necessarily, and there are a lot of things that EDR doesn't catch, as Mike was showing in the example that he showed. There are times where a well-structured attack is able to evade the EDR in the environment, or in some cases disable the EDR. Whereas because there's no agent in the environment, one of the advantages to that is that the attacker doesn't see that elusive is there. There's no agent to give away the game. And so there's nothing to tip off the attacker that there are deceptions in play. And that is definitely an advantage in terms of how we defend against that attack, and basically are able to detect it with a high degree of accuracy.
Great. There was another question about, can't an attacker use a tool like Honeypot Buster to work against this type of deception?
Yeah, so good question. So no, because there's nothing really there for, Honeypot Buster is designed to look at the environment. It's going to look for anomalies in the environment that give it away as being a honeypot, whether it's lack of activity, recent activity, the activity isn't, consistent with what a real user would do, inconsistencies in the way the hardware is structured, et cetera. It's very easy, well, relatively speaking, for, it to determine what it's talking to. When looking at our environment, because we use the self-dissolving binary rather than an agent, that binary runs in about 300 milliseconds and is gone. So there's nothing, first and foremost, for the attacker to run a tool against, a Honeypot Buster or whatever. There's nothing for them to run against, because these are the real production environments that we are planning these deceptions on. And the deceptions look just like real data that we planted there. So it is virtually indistinguishable, from that data. And as a result, there's nothing for a, detection tool like a Honeypot Buster to go out and attempt to identify.
Okay. There was a question asked earlier, Mike, you responded in chat, but I don't think it went to everybody. It just went to the panelists. So I'll just ask the question aloud and we can discuss it. Is the deceptive info presented in the demo, is this info real or synthetic? And would it affect the data I collect regarding my systems or networks?
Yeah, so another good question there. So the data is, is genuinely created. So it's, it's real in terms of the way that it looks in the environment. It is, there are DNS entries associated with the servers. There is, our trap server is going to be answering for those servers on that DNS entry. So from that point of view, it's very authentic, so that it can be the credentials can be harvested by a Mimikatz or Windows Credential Editor, Lazane, et cetera. The difference, I think, is that, what's behind that. When they attempt to follow these credentials, that's when, they set off the alert, effectively, setting off the trap that alerts to the fact that someone has attempted to interact with the deception. In terms of trying to get that data, if you were to do forensics on that endpoint using, a heavy forensics tool, we do have the ability to export all of the deceptions that have been placed on a particular endpoint out, so that anybody doing that, we can give them, these are the things that are there, that so they're aware of, what deceptions have been planted. And that way they can, understand as they're looking through, if they're doing a full forensics on that endpoint, that they can see that.
Okay, I see another question for now. Does Elusive work in cloud environments or just behind the firewall?
Outstanding. Yeah, so good question. So, we can work in both environments, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. We have deceptions that are specific to, or can be placed into either environment, so that, effectively the cloud becomes an extension of that on-premise, environment, and really gives the additional data. Now, we can also place our traps in the cloud. We can, monitor, different servers that are in, say AWS or Azure or Google Cloud, in that environment. So we have a full capability in both places, including planting cloud-specific deceptions, in the environment, so that, again, they now see deceptive connections to cloud services that are planted on endpoints that look real, and would allow them to, or would give the attacker an opportunity to interact with that cloud specific service, and then would basically show up as a deception. Okay,
great. Mike, can you show your screen again, just to share that last slide, the next step slide? I don't know if you can hear me. Oh, there we go. Thanks. There's still time, by the way, if anybody does want to ask any other question. We're continuing to monitor either in the chat or the Q&A. Really good questions so far, but feel free to ask more. But just while we're waiting, I just wanted to say a couple of things. One is Mike referenced earlier, I'll just go to the bottom first, but that we do have a white paper kind of mapping Elusive's capabilities to the NIST Cybersecurity framework. So everybody who has attended the webinar, we will send a copy of that white paper over to you when we send out the recording, so that you'll be able to kind of see the specifics and drill down into that. Obviously, if you have any questions into that on that, you can feel free to email us or let us know. But in addition to that, you can see some of the other things on the screen. That way you can engage with us and find out more information about Elusive, and specifically how we help financial services companies. You can request a demo at the link above. Our resources page has all of our previous webinar recordings and white papers and case studies and many other items. We have a good blog that we talk about a lot about various challenges in cybersecurity, and obviously you can follow us on social as well. Are there any other questions at this point? Okay, I don't see any. Obviously, you can feel free to email us at any point, at any time, and we'll get back to you. So I just wanted to thank our presenters today, Mike St. Cross and Rick Tomlin. Hopefully everybody found the presentation today informative and helpful for you. And like I said, the webinar today has been recorded. We'll send the recording over to you in an email likely by tomorrow morning, along with this white paper. If you have any other questions, feel free to reply to us. Thank you. Have a great rest of the day and stay healthy. Bye, everyone.